Welcome to the show, Harald.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. We're very excited to make this show. My brother is a huge fan of yours.
Oh, thank you.
He's been fanboying. I know you guys have been talking. He's been fanboying a lot. He wanted to come down.
I know. He was very sorry he couldn't.
Well, he may come to the game tomorrow.
But he had a very dodgy excuse.
What was his excuse?
He said the room will get too hot if he's in there. We've got too many people in here.
No, it's actually a fair point. This room can get we're learning about this room because the weather's been so hot.
Yeah.
Just because of natural climate cycles, we've had a naturally very hot
absolutely.
time recently, and
totally predictable.
Totally predictable. And we've had sometimes too many people in this room, and it's got super hot. So that is one of the reasons. But we're going to try and get him down to the Bedford game tomorrow, which we're bringing you to, and so you'll maybe get to see him there. So climate is something we've been touching on this show. What started as a Bitcoin show now covers other subjects naturally as Bitcoin permeates other parts of the world. Energy is one of those topics, and we've had a range of people on the show. I've had Alex Epstein, I've had Andrew Desler, who I'm pretty sure you'll be aware of. I even interviewed on my other podcast quite a while back, Catherine Hayhoe, who I also think is fantastic. And there are a wide range of opinions with regards to how real climate change is, how serious it is, and what we can do about it. And making a show such as the one I did with Desler will have a certain group of people who completely disagree with him, and I'll make a show with Alex Epstein, and another group will completely disagree with him. My interest is purely on what is real, what is happening, and what can be done about it. And so I'm always going to talk to as many people as possible. And you, as somebody who understands climate but also understands Bitcoin, is a super interesting person to get on the show.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Harald, for people who don't know you, it's going to be very useful for you to give a background to who you are, the work you do, and that will help us establish the framework.
Cool. Well, my name is Harald. I'm Austrian by origin. I've been living in Switzerland for most of my professional career. I'm a biochemist / geneticist by training, but I've never worked really in the academic field. Did most of my professional career in consulting, engineering consulting, strategy consulting. Was running my own company in that field for a couple of years in Germany. And then 2016 returned to Switzerland to essentially start for the climate branch of the European Union, which is a body that was completely unknown to me by that time. But essentially it's a $100 million private investor that seeks to invest and de-risk initiatives that bring Europe onto a path of a decarbonized economy. Or what happened with regards to climate laws, the Green Deal came later on. So I was fortunate enough to learn a lot about the climate, learn a lot about the actors and different actorship theories that are going on in the space. I was running essentially a portfolio of equity investments and grant investments for Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. And through this work, actually got in touch with a couple of, it was 2017, blockchain-based idea, blockchain / climate. It was all within the ICO hype, so essentially nothing useful ever came out of this. But this was my first contact to the crypto space. Came for numbers go up, stayed for the revolution, learned the bits and bolts on how European regulation works, how Bitcoin could fit into this, and sort of started to peel the onion for myself, and started to walk this or try to find the balance between institutional settings and legacy institutions and what the Bitcoin revolution can bring to the space. And so I'm convinced, and I appreciate that you picked this up a lot, because I got encouraged to get in touch with you because of the interviews you did with Margaret and with Troy and others, to actually consider that this is something real and that it should be spread more widely. And so I'm super happy to be here.
So with regards to climate change and the issues regarding it, it would be much more useful if we had wide and broad consensus
Mhm.
on what the issues are,
Mhm.
what the potential damage is,
Mhm.
and therefore to plan
Mhm.
mitigation.
Mhm.
I believe myself, people who know this, listen to this, I believe that the climate change is an issue. I
Mhm.
believe it is caused by humans,
Mhm.
and I believe there are consequences down the line.
Mhm.
I've also come to the point where I understand that curtailing access to energy
Mhm.
also has very severe consequences. And despite some people being very critical of Alex Epstein,
Mhm.
he did make me consider that.
Mhm.
And despite people being very critical of people like Desler and
Mhm.
Catherine Hayhoe, they also made me very aware of the issues with regards to climate change. But if we could get to some point of consensus, I think that would be very useful. But I actually feel like we're getting further away from consensus, and a bigger division is starting to arise here with the issues with regards to climate change. And there is now a growing group of people on the opposite side of the climate scientists.
Mhm.
And I think that's for a wide range of reasons. I think there are lobbyists who are successful, as we had with the tobacco industry and as we have with various other industries, in having messages that permeate and successfully change people's minds. I think that happens. But secondly, there's also been some fails on the side of those who are trying to promote the idea that climate change is real. I think there's been some models and claims that, quite frankly, haven't happened. But for you right now, your understanding of where we are with regards to climate change, how would you explain the current, where we are, like the current situation, but as scientifically as possible?
Well, I'm not sure what I can put it into as scientific as possible, but of course, in preparation for this podcast, I went back to essentially the roots and what you find out in this journey into the past. And I'm really convinced that certain things you can only understand through a historical lens. We essentially have a critical moment in 1982 where, ironically, the biggest and best prepared climate scientists came from ExxonMobil.
Yes.
Yeah. And so 1982, there is this famous 40-page report, which is an internal memo, which got released later on, which essentially puts down on paper very clearly to state climate change is real. We as human cause it, because essentially it's an implicit statement, because it says if we burn more fossil fuel, we will cause an accelerated change of the climate. Who is the species that is using fossil fuels to drive its civilization? It's us as humans. So that was the implicit acknowledgement.
They'd made the connection between an increase in carbon in the atmosphere.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
I'm fully aware of this because I interviewed Nathaniel Rich,
yes,
who wrote a book about this.
Yes.
I always forget the name of it. Remember what it is? The decade we could have saved.
It's something like that.
It's do you know this book by Nathaniel Rich?
No, I don't.
Yeah, it's a very good book. He's written a few good books. He's a journalist based out in the US.
Losing Earth.
So he wrote a book that covered that specific period with ExxonMobil.
And I think this is really critical to be understood because if we go back into that time, it was not a conversation of do we doubt whether it's real or not. It's essentially building a strategic argument. How do we deal with this fact? And so I just imagine the ExxonMobil management sitting down and saying, how do we deal with this now? And I imagine they're sitting down and saying, okay, if we look at the lay of the land in terms of strategic positioning, Porter's 5 forces, who are we, who are our rivals, what's the bargaining power of our suppliers? There's almost none. Of our customers, there's almost none. Power of bargaining power of potential substitution, that is a risk. So now how do we deal with this? Because the implicit assumption was if we exceed a certain threshold of carbon in the atmosphere, this will lead to policy changes, which will be detrimental to our business. So I would put it down here for our conversation that there was never any doubt that climate change is real and that we in fact have lost a decade or 2 decades discussing whether or not it's real. Okay.
This is probably why the likes of Catherine. So if I someone like Catherine Hayhoe, if you put her, hey, would you be interested in debating Alex Epstein on climate change? She will just decline it. And her view is that I'm not here to waste my time. I'm not going to debate whether climate change is real or not. It's happening. I'm only interested in working on policy or actions that can change
Understood.
it. Tesla did do the debate with Alex Epstein, and Alex's approach is slightly different. He's not denying climate change. His view is that no, I agree it's real, but we can mitigate this, and by preventing people having access to fossil fuels, we will do more damage than good. I'm not defending either argument, but someone like Catherine is just hands down will not debate people because of this.
No, I think it would be a very interesting conversation, because this is exactly what we actually need to do. Now, there is no point in having a conversation of what happened in the past if we want to go forward, if we want to find a way of how we can go forward. And I think the climate community is not doing itself a favor by saying, we should shut down fossil fuel by tomorrow, because obviously that will lead to detrimental short-term consequences, as we're seeing in Europe right now. So this is not a fruitful conversation to be had. What we need to do instead is, like any company would do, it would say, well, we have a business model, but now we need to find a substitution strategy, how we can get into a new business model. How do you think Apple sat down in 2004 when they just saw that MP3 players are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and they get integrated into your mobile device, which is called a telephone? They didn't choose to go into the telephone business because they were so keen on having a telephone, but they were keen on maintaining their share of MP3 players, which was a massive part of their business and their revenue, to be continued in a new reality, which is called the mobile age. And I think the same conversation we need to have with regards to energy, even if we look at the International Energy Agency and the different scenario plannings. None of these scenarios predicts a world in 2100 below 30% fossil fuel energy in the supply mix. I think we can go do better than that. I think we need to do better than that if we are serious about 1.5 degree. So my tether, my North Star in all these conversations is essentially this emergent reality that 1.5 degree global warming compared to pre-industrial age is a key figure that we need to work towards, and we need to be very creative on how we can make that work. But we cannot compromise on 1.5 degrees. Because the damages and the consequences, if we only reach 2 degrees, are too detrimental for the human civilization to accept. Meaning, at 2 degrees, for instance, you have 2.5 billion people that will run out of water in sub-Saharan Africa, which will lead to huge climate migrations. And this is not a dystopian argument. I mean, if you look into France right now, you see this process is accelerating and what it means if even Western civilizations are running out of water.
But to challenge you there, because it's right to challenge you, there have been grand claims made in the past, lots of very grand claims. There was specific claims with regards to the ozone layer and acid rain. There was claims that we would all be underwater by a certain time. So what I want to know is, if somebody is claiming that 2.5 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa will not have access to water, how do we know this?
Well, we don't really know it. It's of course part of a scenario planning exercise, but I think the question to me is a different one. If we have the possibility to contain global warming to 1.5 degree, why would we not try to do it? Well,
I think the best argument for that would be is the trade-off. What is the trade-off between 1.5 and 2? What do we have to do to get to 1.5, and what are the costs to humans and civilization, and what is the impact of going to 2? To me, this is the argument. By the way, I'm with you.
No, I understand. I understand all that. But the question remains the same, even if we work with a 2 degree scenario. Currently, we're at 2.7 to 3.5. So if you want to discuss whether this is going to be detrimental or not, we can have that conversation, but then it's not me with whom you want to have that conversation. So even if we talk about a 2 degree global warming threshold, the question remains the same. If we are able to do it, why wouldn't we do it? And the question that I am interested in is asking myself, what is the policy side doing at the moment to make this work? What are the assumptions this policy side is building its policies on? What are the climate models trying to predict, and how robust are they on the surface? On the base when it comes, or how concrete are they at the base when it really comes to concrete climate action? So this is sort of the onion that I try to peel.
Yeah, and I think part of the fear that comes from those who are either skeptical or against the conversations, whatever the range of views are, I think comes from a place of massive distrust at the moment for centralized entities, institutions, governments.
Yes.
Fear that this is used, weaponized for tax policy.
Oh, yes.
That their friends in government or close to government will benefit, that Nancy Pelosi will know exactly which companies that should be financed on the green side and will successfully invest in them. Like all the bullshit that we've seen during COVID, which, by the way, I personally fell for a whole bunch of this shit. I think that is where the fear comes from.
Yes.
Is how do you establish policy which is overall net good for people and isn't just a tool or a weapon of these failed centralized institutions?
And 100% agree with them. I'm sitting here in a Bitcoin podcast because I'm massively distrustful towards the institutions. I think that we need to be a bit more surgical when it comes to understanding how these institutions operate. Some of the arguments are just too simple for me. Due to my experience, or according to my experience, these are not bad people. They are not ill-intended. They do their best, but based on a very compromised understanding of the world. Okay, so I'm sitting here because I think a lot of these narratives, also within the IPCC reports, are problematic, and I'm happy to dig into that because I think this is a quintessential point to be understood before we can have a conversation around how does Bitcoin fit in all of this.
Okay, talk to me about that.
Good. So I think the most...
Explain to people who IPCC are.
So the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. It is essentially a body that has been created in 1988 as you would call it a joint venture out of the World Meteorological Organization and the UNFCCC, which is the UN entity which deals with the climate change issue. And this is the panel which is the scientific body that gathers all the information that is available on the climate and then publishes reports on describing the state of play at a certain given point in time. And they do this through regular reports. And these are the important reports when it comes to, or these reports cater to governments, all governments around the world, to inform their policy making on climate-related decisions.
Are they a respected and trusted body?
Well, on the whole, yes,
Okay.
Absolutely. And I know this is also a point of controversy. I recommend everybody who doubts academic publishing or scientific publishing to go and read those reports. In terms of scientific craftsmanship, that's best in class.
Okay.
And they are really well vetted. And so we are Bitcoiners, and if you don't trust it, then fucking verify it.
Yeah.
Because all is publicly available. The reports are available, the supplementary material is available, all the models are available, all the assumptions within the models are available. Everything is open source. And I think that's a really good thing. But it's a massive body of work to dig deep into this. And I was fortunate enough to have this as a profession, to learn how good they actually are. And I don't want to qualify on how good they are. I think there are very interesting aspects in them, but there are also flaws in them. And I would love to discuss what I think are the interesting ups and the positives and negatives.
We've done some research on this in the past as well, because one of the criticisms of climate scientists is that the models, people use models to actually attack them. But actually, in our research, Danny, they're pretty accurate, weren't they? There have been failed models.
Oh yeah,
certainly, but that's the exception, not the norm. Actually, the models have been more recent ones even more accurate.
Which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
The more data sets you get in, the more you can incorporate, the better the models are. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So from that point, you talked about, and I know you were discussing this in preparation with Neil, you talked about some of the flaws within
Mm-hmm.
the overall climate change conversations. I mean, I'm starting to recognize them, but
Mm-hmm.
where would you say is we're having like a lot of difficulty? Like, all I want is to make progress. If somebody is sat across the table for me
Mm-hmm.
who is a skeptic,
Mm-hmm.
I want to know, how do we get to a point where we're in agreement, where we both have a set of facts, we're like, okay, that is truth, that is
Yeah.
fact, and we can agree
Yeah.
and make progress. I'm not here to push a single agenda.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm wrong, I want to know if I'm wrong,
Mhm.
and if they're wrong, I want to help them know if
Mhm.
they're wrong. Like, how do we get to that point? Because if this is science, it should be pretty obvious. It should be like, here are the facts. This is where we're heading. These are the consequences. Okay, this is what we need to work with. And by the way, I think the most complicated part of all of this is that climate change is a global issue, which has got local and regional interests.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's certain companies who have a massive interest in helping people believe this isn't an issue, because
Mhm.
their entire business model, which is
Mhm.
worth billions of profit every year, completely
Mhm.
crash.
Mm-hmm.
And just as a complete side point, I think people should look to Saudi and see what's happening there. That is a country whose entire business model is based on the extraction of hydrocarbons,
Mm-hmm.
but they are changing their
Massively.
business model at the moment, and they are investing heavily in sports. And they've bought into Newcastle. They've started a golf tournament. You know, they are, and they've just announced this new mega wall city. Like, that is a country that recognizes that its business model needs
yeah.
to change.
Absolutely. Well, a couple of things here. I wouldn't call it flaws,
Okay.
because I think what humans do naturally is we have a very complex reality which we try to abstract in a certain way to make our life just easier. And I think on a policy level, you do the same thing, but you need to read the primary data in order to be able to identify where we might have taken the wrong turn. So let's focus for a second on the special report which came out, which is just called Global Warming of 1.5 degrees in 2019. It's a massive document. It's 260 pages. Of course, there are executive summaries and everything. But what is really interesting is the fact that it represents a synthesis of all the different models that have been used in the past to model climate change, but also to describe mitigation pathways. Okay, so let's put that to the side for a second. I think it's really important that we talk about those when it comes to Bitcoin. On a higher aggregation level, it's super fascinating because it was the first time that this report asked the question, well, in what world are those mitigation pathways actually embedded in? Now, that makes total sense, because if you look at the world which is highly cooperative, a certain action can look very different to a world that, or feasible, than to a world where the world is highly competitive. And so what they did is they incorporated the so-called shared socio-economic pathways, which essentially is a description of the state of play when it comes to how does the world look like in terms of geopolitical condition. And it assumes fairly that there might be a world where the world is highly cooperative, it recognizes collectively that we need to do something about climate change, and is willing to act in a cooperative manner towards that path. It's called the SSP1 pathway, the green road. Then on the other extreme, there is a world which it's almost a bit dystopian, because it describes it. Well, I need to read this up.
It's fine.
Because it's just so accurate. So it's called the
Harold has receipts.
I have.
Do you have something so we can pull it up there?
No, I don't.
Where does that come from? Is that from the
that's-
internet?
Yeah, of course. No.
Well, then Danny's got. We have the internet here in Bedford.
All right.
Well, it's pretty bad.
Yeah, that's true.
So look up the 5 shared socioeconomic pathways.
Hi, Jerome.
Where is Peter, by the way?
We've retired Peter Schiff.
Okay.
Yeah, he's done. We've had enough Peter Schiff. We've moved on to Jerome Powell. I'm not feeling Jerome.
You know?
No.
Please put up Lagarde. That would be so much more appropriate.
The card's interesting. I feel like, I want...
In terms of like lossless level.
But he's telling you which way inflation's going in the UK.
Yeah, I'm just not feeling Jerome like I used to feel Peter Schiff.
What?
Stop it. I feel like can you find it?
Yeah, I can find it, but the internet's not loading anything. So
we
you said we had the infinite investor.
We
do. Just in the village I live in, it's pretty shit.
No, but it's easy to explain. So essentially, it's called
Here we go.
the rivalry.
Is this it?
Regional rivalry scenario. Leave all of that out. Blah 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 blah. There needs to be some kind of a matrix.
Here you go.
This is cool.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
it's called the Rocky Road. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So it assumes a world where we have high population, low economic growth per capita, low human development, low technological process, resource-intensive lifestyle, resource-constrained energy and food demand per capita, focus on regional food and energy security, regionalization and lack of global cooperation.
yeah, it sounds pretty fucked.
Does that sound somehow familiar? And then you have...
Is that the current state of play?
No, wait. I think this is where it gets super interesting.
Okay.
And then we have the inequality scenario, which essentially assumes a lot of tensions between different populations. So city versus rural, working class with elites, and so on and so forth. Okay. And then there's a fossil fuel development, which is actually a really interesting one, which assumes we're not changing much. We just use a shitload of energy that we can produce out of fossil fuels to mitigate climate change. Sounds absurd, but of course you need energy to also do a lot of carbon capture and storage and so on and so forth.
Okay.
They're all essentially assumptions, yeah. And then you have the SSP2 pathway, which essentially is called the middle of the road. So it's a compromise. We're not so much in rivalry. We're not so much in cooperation. We're somewhere right down the middle. And the funny thing is, what the IPCC scientists then did, they ran the 22 integrated assessment models, which are all open source. You can check them, you can verify them, and ran them under the different socioeconomic pathways, and said, okay, can we find a way of how we can reach 1.5 or 2 degree global warming until 2100 under those boundary conditions, societal boundary conditions. And here is where I think something very, very problematic happened, because the IPCC said, rightfully as scientists, cool, SSP1, clearly we can do it. SSP2, we can do it. There's even a 2 degree pathway in SSP5, but there's no 1.5 degree scenario in SSP3 and in SSP4.
Right, and so let's read SSP3. A resurgent nationalism concerns over the competitiveness and security of regional conflict, push boundaries to increase focus on domestic or at most regional issues, policies. Basically feels like where we are right now.
Well, I think it's even worse. I think if SSP3 and SSP4 would have an ugly child, this is where we are in.
Inequality, highly unequal investments in human capital combined with increases in disparities in economic opportunity and political power lead to increase in inequalities and stratification, both across and within countries. Yes. I mean, it feels like we are that ugly child.
And so this...
But it feels like we've become that ugly child over the last 5 to 10 years.
Yes.
Like
absolutely.
This is a recent issue,
absolutely,
which you can see with the conflict in Ukraine, Russia, and the culture wars.
Absolutely. I'm 100% with you on that. And I think this is where you need to understand the flaws of political institutions, because then the IPCC made something which is, from a policy perspective, relatively straightforward and understandable. But they said, we do not have a 1.5 or 2 degree pathway for SSP3 and SSP4, so we reject them.
Okay.
We just don't look at them. We ignore them. We just focus on an illusionary world where we are all cooperative because we have the Paris Agreement, and we build all the policies based on that.
And we hope.
Yeah. And we YOLO into SSP1 or SSP2, build our policies around that, and then we just see what happens.
Yeah.
So this is essentially...
Because if you're SSP3 or SSP4, you might as well not do anything.
Or you need to look at completely different options and completely different interventions that would make sense in an SSP3 or SSP4 world.
The problem in those with those different interventions, they're probably likely the scenarios that we've seen during COVID that haven't worked anyway, and probably accelerated us towards SSP3 and SSP4.
That might very well be.
Okay.
I don't know, but I think what is interesting for us in this conversation with regards to Bitcoin, and I'm coming back to this later on, is, well, Bitcoin is made for exactly that world, because it aligns the incentives in a non-cooperative environment. It eliminates the trust that is required for cooperative action. So we can qualify that later on.
Yeah.
I think it has different intervention points where this could make sense and will make sense. Now, the second piece that I want to touch upon is, now, if we look at the models themselves, and that's super interesting. And I'm not a modeling expert, but I guess most people know how modeling works. So essentially what you do is you have multivariables as inputs that you qualify. So you give them certain values, and then you run a so-called regression analysis, which then looks at possible outputs and then asks the question, is this output that I need within the realm of the independent variables that I've used as inputs? So that this is essentially how modeling works.
I don't think most people do know how modeling works.
Okay. Do most people understand how modeling works now?
Is that a bit better? I do now. I would have further questions. If we were making a show on modeling, I would have further...
please, then don't invite me.
I would have further questions, but you go, man.
Then don't invite me. And so the models are still sort of black boxes for me, because I'm not a modeling expert. There are people who are just much better at this than I am. But what is interesting is what is published is the input variables that are considered for the models themselves. And I think here is where it gets really interesting, because every model has essentially so the categories for the models, or the inputs for the models are all the same for all the models. So essentially they assume, what if we can make buildings way more efficient by X% at scale? What if we can decarbonize traffic by X%? What if we can mitigate landfill gas by X%? What if we can use regenerative agriculture to produce our food? So these are very high-level assumptions that then go into these models, are then sort of cooked, and then give you a certain output, whether under these assumptions the 1.5 or 2 degree targets can be reached or not. So again, and now we have two very interesting aspects where we essentially see flaws within the state of play of the climate community right now, because we're building all our climate actions on a false assumption that we are living in a cooperative world. And I'm here to put my hands down and say the Paris Agreement is dead. It will not be revived. We will not make it work. So we need to find better ways of how we can actually get to a 2 degree or 1.5 degree global warming without being in a cooperative environment.
Okay, just on that. So you're saying it's dead. It isn't publicly dead. Remind me, did Trump pull America out of the Paris Agreement? He did.
Yes.
Okay.
But it was a political stunt. Nobody cared about it anyways.
No, of course. Yes, that was about Trump. Like, fully aware of that. But
so
also,
just to be 100% clear, he pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement, but there is a 4-year delay period before you actually pull out. So the US has been there all along.
Was there any validity to his arguments? Danny, can you look up what Trump said?
No,
because sometimes
Can we just please not go there? Because the argument was I'm the president of America and not of Paris.
Well, you say that, but actually there are times in the past I've been critical of Trump, and actually some of the things have been pretty good. Like,
look at the UN speech in 2016 with regards to Germany. It was spot on.
He was absolutely nailed it.
Spot on.
He nailed it. He said they were too reliant on Russian energy, and here we are. Yes. Germany is facing blackouts.
Yes.
I just want to know exactly what it is he said. And can we just do it?
Of course. It's your show.
You're the guest though. You can say, no, fuck you, Pete, I'm leaving.
I mean, I've got his statement here. He said a lot.
Right, let's go to the top. Right, thank you very much. Applause. Thank you. I would like to begin by addressing... Oh, no, I don't need that. I've just returned for a trip overseas where nearly 300... I don't care about that. My meet of the G7... Right, one by one, we're keeping the promise I made to the American people during my campaign for president, whether it's cutting job-killing regulations, appointing and confirming a tremendous Supreme Court, yada, yada, yada. On these issues and many more, we're following through on our commitments, and I don't want anything to get in our way. I'm fighting every day for a great people of this country. Okay, I get the point. My duty to protect American citizens. The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. Applause. Thank you, thank you. But begin negotiations to re-enter either the Paris Accord or an entirely new transaction on terms that are fair to the United States, its business, its workers, its people, its taxpayers. So we're getting out. But we will start to negotiate. Yada, yada. I suppose that I can put no other consideration for the taxpayers to absorb the cost of the loss of jobs, wages, draconian financial and economic burdens the agreement imposes on our country, compliance with the terms of the Paris Accord are onerous, and energy restrictions it placed on the United States and would cost America as much as 2.7 million lost jobs by 2025, according to the National Economic Research Associate. This includes 440,000 fewer manufacturing jobs, what we need. What I would want to know, where are those jobs lost, but are new jobs gained by people moving into other areas? Okay, I mean, look.
I went cross-eyed already. I mean, it's all fair game. It was a political stunt. America first made, this move makes sense under an American first policy.
But is America the biggest pollutant?
I imagine it's China.
Still.
No, it's still the US.
It's still the US. Can we have a look? Look at that. And I wonder if it because of that, the requirements under Paris Accord therefore hit them the most. Like, I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, because that's one of these challenges. It's like, who bears the biggest burden?
It goes. This is a big and important conversation.
No, China now is double the United States.
Oh,
top 10 polluters.
Okay.
India's half of the US. Russia's. UK isn't even top 10. Go UK.
You need to try harder.
All right, go on.
This plays into the argument like we cannot save the world.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
heard that.
Yeah.
The truth is the Paris Agreement made very clear through something that is called the National Determined Commitments, which have been signed by the countries, that this is the quota that you need to fulfill. So it was never meant as you need to save the world, but it was meant as this is the problem and this is how we cut it down into national determined commitments, and this is your share that you need to burden.
Yeah, I think the reason I wanted it up there was to make the point that one of the biggest problems is the political cycle and the careers and objectives of a president to be re-elected versus the needs of the planet.
Yes.
That is something that exists. The political cycle, the 4-year, 5-year political cycle, depending on the terms of your country, is often something which causes short-term decision-making which negatively impact countries. It's typically with the money and borrowing and debt that countries build up, tends to be built up because current administrations are always focused on being re-elected in 4 years.
Yes.
So they print the shit out of money and they pass the problem on to generations further down the road. The political cycle, to me, is one of the most damaging things we have in society.
But it's a reality.
But yeah, of course.
Just to add one more point to the point, like we cannot save the world. There is one element which builds deliberate asymmetry into sharing the burden into the Paris Agreement, which is the so-called conversation around loss and damage, which means rich Western countries have over decades fucked the poorer countries.
Of course.
Okay? So the Paris Agreement wants to get that straight and say, look, because you have profited over proportionally from the extraction of goods and commodities and whatever, and have over proportionally affected the poorer countries through the already the ramifications of climate change already, you need to build up a fund, a loss and damage fund, to finance the adaptation measures in the poorer countries. Now, guess what happens?
People say no.
No, they signed that and they pledged. Well, what do you think happened then?
I have no idea. Tell me. Don't make me make a shit guess.
The fund never materialized.
Right, okay.
Because, of course, nobody wants to pay the bill.
But I also find that strange because I do know how much aid large countries that sends to other smaller countries.
Yeah.
And I know that's politicized itself, but it does happen.
Oh, yeah. I cannot comment on that. I don't have any opinion, but I'm just saying, like, I'm looking at what do we have installed, what are the mechanics of the process, and where does it get stalled for what reason? Yeah. So, of course, the political cycle is a problem. Of course, the sellability, is that even a word, to your constituents is a problem. Yes. But there's also very urgent needs that usually overrule and trump the long-term ambition of any country. Yeah. So let's be clear, these reports, they were written in 2018, so they were multi-annual bodies of work. So essentially what we're looking at is a rearview mirror into the happy camper age of 2015. Okay, when the Paris Agreement was signed and everybody was happy. 2022, fast forward, we're facing a very different world.
Okay, Paris is dead. What now?
Well, that's what we're here discussing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think our conversation would help the conversation to start it from a very different place.
Okay.
And say, SSP1 is dead. Paris Agreement is dead. We're fucked. And I also say that in my company. So I'm the one that is known to be the one that says we're fucked. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this lightly. I went through very, very hard phases. I worked for the European Union in this climate action field for 7 years. I've seen it to the bone how these organizations operate. Again, I'm not blaming it. I'm doing a real surgical analysis out of my experience and drawing my own conclusions how I as an individual can contribute to an effort to make this a better world.
Yeah, no, I mean, but I also agree. I also think we're fucked.
Oh, yeah.
And like, I know the issues there. Have I drastically changed even my life at an individual level? No, I haven't. I'm a fucking hypocrite.
But we all are.
Yeah. But at the same time, I'm looking at countries and their energy production is only going in one direction. Okay, and we needed to go, certainly in terms of renewables, in a drastically different direction. And we are in a world in conflict. Mm-hmm. And I just don't see, every time I read something like you've put together or something else, I was like, this is just not going to happen. Like in my head, there's part of me that's already thinking, what is the mitigation I put in place to protect my children when we head to a very different world because things haven't happened?
But you know the answer. You have an answer to that. I have an answer to that. So
I build a bunker, lots of Bitcoin and gold, produce my own food, get some guns, some tinned pineapple.
Yeah, I mean, to parts of that I agree. But I think it offers us a different level of conversation to look at where does it make sense to interact or rely on governments, and where do we need to take a bottom up. Or whether we need to build a bottom-up movement that can allow us to regain agency in a process that we got completely disenfranchised.
Hold on. So are you saying that we should no longer rely on centralized institutions to solve this? You think this can come?
I think it needs to come from us.
Okay.
I personally think that we are we're seeing the end of the traditional institutions as we know it.
Yes, they're breaking apart.
Yeah, and I think it totally makes sense if you look at again into history, and how people always seek to find some level of coordination and cooperation, and these proof of stake resembling third parties that sort of we can sort of rely on and trust to do things for us that we would not be able to otherwise do ourselves in an uncoordinated manner. They have been proven very useful until a certain point. Okay.
Okay.
And I think what we need to be prepared about, to be prepared for, is that those institutions do understand that they are in decline. I'm a big European. I consider myself a European citizen. I love this continent for all its diversity, its differences, its cultural differences. I've not been much to the US, so I don't want to praise that too much. But
can I ask a question on that? Are you also pro-EU?
Not pro-EU in the current form. I think there is. I think the nail in the coffin of the European Union, as it is right now, went in at the latest in 2004. Now I can explain to you if you're interested what that means.
Yeah.
But
There's a reason I ask you, because I'm
Right.
very, very pro-Europe. As somebody who travels to America a lot and also loves a huge amount about America, I love the diversity in America, but I also think that a lot of Europeans could benefit from understanding America more, and vice versa. The thing I love about Europe is, my favorite things about Europe is I can travel anywhere in Europe,
Oh yeah.
feel very safe,
Oh yeah.
and meet people with a different language and different culture,
Mhm.
but a very similar outlook on life, quite a similar sense of humor.
Mhm.
I think Europeans have a very, very good ability to work together, to cooperate,
Mhm.
even though we are, essentially different countries.
Mhm.
I think post World War II, I think what's happening in Europe is incredible.
Yeah.
I struggle with the EU, but that's the bureaucrats fucking it up.
We are on the same page, and I think this is why it pains me so much, because I think that there is the price that we paid for free movement, and not to convert to another currency, is what we see now is too high for what we get, for what we pay on the other side of the equation.
But you can blame the problems in that on essentially the same people you can blame with the problems in the US.
Let me
it's
explain.
all the centralized institutions.
Yeah.
Like-
And how they have been built. I mean,
Yeah.
I think so let's not go too much into the details of how the EU does its legislation and how it builds its institutions. But I think one piece is really, really important. The post-war stability came essentially from the two big nations within the European Union, which is Germany and France. Okay, so this is essentially where
Too big?
Yes, I'm sorry, but this is essentially, these were two war parties. Yeah, these were the two war parties that had to reconcile and find peace with each other. This is essentially the big axis in the European Union. I know you look at me very disgusted. but
I mean, it was Churchill. It was Churchill who stood his ground against Hitler. I mean, I think we played a very important role. But come on,
I don't want to idealize it, but this is essentially,
I'm fucking with you.
Yeah, I know.
And slightly disappointed.
So, and I think a lot of this institutionalism that followed was very much built on, it's gonna be fine. We're gonna work this out because we trust each other, and we know where blind trust leads us. And I think where this problem really surfaced was when we introduced a monetary union around 2000 without actually having a plan for a fiscal union.
Well, there was no fiscal union.
Well, it was in plan. It was in plan, but it got voted down by the French and by the Dutch in 2005.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so essentially, suddenly you were stuck in the monetary union without actually knowing how you're going to balance that on the other end of the equation. So, and this is, I think, where the asymmetry started to really show, and where the destabilization process actually started. And now you have a EU that is, by the way, really efficient. It's using very little money for its administrative processes. Okay, but it does not have a lot of geopolitical power, institutions to get anything done. Okay, so
do you know about the whole moving of the European Parliament to Strasbourg for 3 days every month?
I don't know about that.
This is insane. This is my favorite thing about the European Parliament. Daddy, look this up. Search up the European Parliament in Strasbourg. So, as far as I'm aware, when the original agreements and discussions about forming the European Parliament were created, France were suspicious of it being entirely based in Belgium.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Right, we just loaded this up. Why does the European Parliament move between Brussels and Strasbourg? Because they were looking at ways to save money, and they realised 103 million euros were spent annually. Here we go. The EU's national government decided in 1992 to lay down in the EU treaty where the EU institutions are officially seated. The decision had important consequences for the working arrangements for the Parliament, its official seat and venue, blah, 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 blah. A 2013 study by the European Parliament shows 103 million euros could be saved per year should all European Parliament operations be transferred from Strasbourg to Brussels. That's not it. That's not what it is.
But you're pointing into
But the point is,
you're pointing into a
every
good
month,
direction.
For 3 days, the lorries go to Brussels, they collect everything, they move it all to Strasbourg, and they operate there for 3 days a month.
Mm-hmm.
And then they move it all back. All the computers...
Because it's all based on quotas. It's all based on quotas. Every country needs to have a certain EU institution.
Yeah, but...
Every country needs a commissioner, blah, blah, blah. This
yeah,
is how
but
it goes.
come on. Somebody at some point must have said, hold on. So what you're saying is we're going to move the whole parliament for 3 days. This is fucking idiotic.
Yeah.
But they did it. They do
Yeah.
it.
But let's not get hung up on that.
I know. I
because
just think it's funny.
It is funny, and it's also ridiculous, you know.
But this
and
is the people we're relying on.
You should not be surprised that people are losing their trust in those type of institutions.
No, of course.
You know, if the only legislation you get done is what type of vegetables you're allowed to sell in your store, you know, it's ridiculous. And I think that, you know, I read this yesterday. I don't know who posted it, but it was really interesting. Our relationship to the national government or to a superior government like the EU, there is still a relationship. You know, it's not either or. It's not either or. It's both. Relies on the fact that I give up my freedoms and liberties to a certain extent. I comply with the laws in exchange for security, which means you supply me with energy, or you provide energy sufficiency, you provide food sufficiency, you provide me with a stable currency, you provide me with defense, and you can do none of that.
Benjamin Franklin will be shaking his head. Is it Benjamin Franklin who said that? Whoever gives up security.
Yeah, but it's a Europe.
I know.
I think this is really important to understand that there is something deeply European, and I think also something deeply healthy in this ability and this wanting to trust each other. But this can go badly wrong, you know? Like,
was it Benjamin Franklin?
Yeah, he said those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety.
Yeah, which is a very, very. It sounds very cool, but actually,
I wouldn't go that far.
Well, Europe is built on cooperation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think this is why, if you do a surgical analysis of, we've moved now from Paris Agreement to political institutions, now you can ask yourself, okay, if I want to do something, what is my best shot that I have to gain agency in both the climate challenge as well as a citizen in the European Union or in this continent? And I think that Bitcoin has a role to play in both.
Okay.
Yeah. So my vision let's make it very concrete. I think I want to bring in another piece that could be interesting to discuss, which is how now this, what we agree is a rather dysfunctional body, approaches crypto and Bitcoin, because there's a big regulation coming out.
Well, I do have another question before we get to that.
Yes.
Like, what is the actual solution? Because we're about to get into the method of solving this and how we get there. But like, what is the solution? Like,
thanks for asking the simple questions.
by the way, this chart that is incredible. Anyone who's listened to the show, we're about to walk through a chart which talks about energy use, energy generation. It's brilliant.
I think it's one of the most resourceful sites that anyone can dig into who is interested in data, not only regarding climate change, but also economic activity. I recommend that a lot. So what we can see here is that...
Yeah, try to explain how this chart looks to somebody who's listening.
Yeah.
We will put it in the show notes. But
so it's essentially a pie chart that describes in detail per industry what the industry's contribution, the sector's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is. And it pies it out in a way that sort of in the highest aggregation form, we only have a couple of big industries left which contribute to essentially 100% of GHG emissions. And what we can see is that the energy sector, directly or indirectly, contributes about 75%, give or take, to the CO2 emissions. And I think that's important. If you ask me, what is the solution? We need to understand energy. We need to understand energy generation, energy distribution and energy consumption and where the majority of the energy is actually consumed.
So just a quick question. I'll explain to the people who are listening. So the pie chart essentially says energy is 73.2%. Agriculture, forestry and land use is 18.4%.
Yeah.
Waste is 3.2%. And then industry is 5.2%. And then in each one of those, when you go and check out the chart, it breaks it down further.
Mm-hmm.
But where we have industry as cement and chemicals as 3% and 2.2% separately, but within energy use, we have iron and steel at 7.2%. Why is cement and chemicals not? Is that a byproduct of the manufacture?
I cannot answer that question. I think there are some conscious choices around how this gets displayed. Because you're absolutely right. I mean,
but it could be that the production of cement leads to a CO2 emissions, whereas iron and steel, it's the use of the energy.
It's indirect. Yes.
Yeah, it's
exactly.
indirect and indirect. So it could be that. I'd like to know that. Okay. And then so when I see iron and steel is 7.2% total. That is in using the energy that industry uses. So
Correct.
if you electrify that part, if the energy generation came from renewables, for all of that could be zero. Okay, interesting.
Directly zero, but indirectly, of course, you would have an effect. Yes.
And I would look at something like aviation at 1.9% and say, well, we can't do anything about that because we're not going to... Like Boeing are not going to produce.
We cannot do anything structural about it because people want to move, and people will want to move, and there is no way that in the short term we can substitute the fuel to synthetic fuels in a way that it would help the climate cause. But I think it's actually an interesting item you're pointing towards, because we get a lot hung up on these these really nice examples of shaming airlines.
Yeah,
and
we shame airlines and it's 2%, and we shame Bitcoin mining. I wonder where Bitcoin would be on this chart. It would be like
I think this is exactly the conversation that we need to have.
So one more question before we start breaking it down. So when I see deforestation as 2.2%, but that isn't an increase, that isn't the carbon going into the atmosphere. That's the
opportunity cost.
Yes, the opportunity cost by having a reduced absorption of
carbon sequestration.
Okay. Yeah, this chart's fucking brilliant. I'm honestly, if you're listening, whatever your beliefs are, go and check this chart out. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think this is, once you see it from that aggregated level, you also understand that if you ask me now, where are the different intervention points where Bitcoin could make sense, it becomes pretty clear. So we need to distinguish two things here. There's energy that gets produced and generated, which never sees a grid, right? So for instance, these large steel mills, they usually have direct purchasing agreements, long-term direct purchasing agreements with for their baseline with a reliable energy supplier, but they also purchase energy from the grid.
Well, what my question is very simple.
Yeah.
If we want to reduce the burning, or if we want to reduce the amount of increase in carbon in the atmosphere, what are the quick wins here? So you look at something like transport, 16.2%. If we move to an electrified fleet of vehicles globally, that means that is a number we can erode.
Yes, if you are sure that the electrification or the energy actually comes from a renewable source, which is not that easy.
Yeah.
And I think this is exactly where we have to have a more nuanced conversation, because what we now know is where this conversation starts from is we know that the majority of the grid is still considered fossil, so carbon intensive.
Okay.
There's a growing minority of the grid that is renewable. The problem here is that this is a complex interaction between the energy generators, the grid operators, and the consumers. Okay, so it's not that easy to just say, and you've covered that. We don't have to go into this in detail, right? I mean, Jean Cornell talked about that very eloquently. There is a lever here where we say, how can we start to decarbonize the energy sector by slowly, emphasis on slowly, substituting fossil fuel related energy sources with renewable energy sources. Why does this make economic sense? Because the price curve for the renewables is massively decreasing, while obviously the marginal cost for fossil fuel is going up because it gets harder and harder to produce it. Now we are in a very special circumstance at the moment, which is not reflective for neither the past nor hopefully the long-term future.
Just a quick question.
Go.
What's the role of nuclear in this for you?
Personally,
Yeah.
I think nuclear needs to be a part of the equation.
Agreed.
If you look at how efficiently we use energy, we've moved from, a little bit of dry grass to wood, to coal, to uranium. Yeah. So it's
To fission.
maybe to fission in the future.
Well, fingers crossed.
Yeah. But I think when we talk about baseload, so in short, reliable baseload supply, nuclear needs to be part of the equation. It's from a climate perspective, it's clean.
Cleanish.
Cleanish, yes. Yes, you have a long-term problem of storage.
We found out the other day that the big tanks of green goo is a myth. I was kind of disappointed.
What is green goo?
Like in The Simpsons, at the nuclear plant, they have the big tanks of green goo that leaks into the river and creates a three-eyed fish. There's no
shit.
There's no green goo.
Okay. I'm super relieved to hear that.
Yeah, I might sound like a moron, and I hope I get backed up by here, but I imagine there was some kind of goo. Did you?
I mean, I didn't expect it to be like The Simpsons, but I didn't know what it looked like.
Did you expect it to be a goo, though?
I don't think so, is the truth. I expected like rods.
Shut up. You're just saying that
I mean,
to make me look stupid.
yeah.
See, that's why he's the natural successor.
Good.
Fuck you, Danny. All right.
And I think once we start to understand that it's not that simple to stabilize grids through simple scaling of renewable energies, we start to have a better conversation about what it really takes to accomplish that. For instance, we know that there is a massive amount of projects that have been developed, specifically in the UK, by the way, through government subsidies for solar and wind.
And to anyone who says, yes, but it's government subsidies, let's just be real. The fossil fuel industry is highly
6
subsidized.
trillion.
Yeah.
6 trillion.
So
yeah.
Come on.
So this is not a free market. It's a highly corrupted market for various reasons.
Uh-huh.
And so what happens now is if you have these projects which essentially could generate a lot of energy, we're talking gigawatts here and gigawatt hours here, this cannot be dispatched to the grid. And why is that? Because the grid operator says, with this additional supply, we cannot balance our grid proportionally or appropriately because we do not know how we can dispatch it to a demand. Yeah, and so they say, well, either so what we need to do now is to widen our bandwidth. So we need more bandwidth on the grid. Well, the question is, who is going to pay for that? Now the grid operator says, I'm not going to pay for that, but the regulator says you have to do that. And then the grid operator says, if I have to do it, then I will cascade the cost down to the end consumer. So we see this is a very, very complex relationships and the political game of who is carrying the water in the very end. And on top of that, you have now someone needs to have these projects in the 100 millions on their books. Now these are very costly projects that still have a maintenance cost but don't return you anything.
But if we look at where it has happened, parts of Scandinavia have been very successful moving to renewables. Even Germany was fairly successul in transitioning to some renewable.
Germany was the pioneer of all of this.
Yes.
Yeah.
But they decommissioned their nuclear plants and became reliant on Russian natural gas, which is a separate issue.
Yeah.
But and also Texas isn't Texas like 70%? I
think wrong. It's had days over 70%.
Days over.
Yes.
But like Texas as an oil and gas, it's oil and gas country over there, boy, and they have successfully been transitioning over time to renewables.
Yes. Because the business case makes sense.
Yes.
Now you ask me, what are the solutions? Okay.
Yeah.
What is the natural price of energy? if you produce it or generate it? Nothing. It's zero. So you need a customer to pay something for it. Now, what you're looking for is buyers of first resort. Who is willing to buy that energy under all circumstances? There are not many.
The government isn't?
Well, what do you do with this energy? You need to understand about energy. You cannot just discard it. Energy cannot be destroyed. So once you produce the energy, it needs to be actively managed out if nobody uses it. Do you want to hear a cool example on that?
Tell me.
So in Austria, the main energy supplier has an agreement, a framework agreement with the Austrian railways, so that if they have too much supply running on their grid, the Austrian railways is running their locomotives empty, just to kill the energy, just to destroy the energy.
Oh yeah, this is like running the toasters, right?
It's like running the toaster, but the locomotive takes a bit more energy, so this is really good. So once you understand that, you can ask who is the buyer and who pays here? Who pays here? The energy provider pays. Okay, so it's negatively priced enery.
So they might as well spend that on some ASICs. And
what if you only would have a solution that would buy this energy either for free or for a symbolic 1 cent? You already would be in a better situation than if you were just, always troubled by how to curtail and how to kill this energy.
Okay, so listen, we've covered this on the show a lot. Yeah. Bitcoin miners will buy that.
Bitcoin miners will buy that.
They will buy it, and if it is a low enough price, they will take that and they will turn that into money, and we will grow the Bitcoin network. Cool. We will increase security. We'll improve the money. We'll improve the world. We've covered this. So my question for you is, like, everybody listening knows that they buy that. Great. Two things. Firstly, if every single grid was to attach Bitcoin miners to its network, firstly, are there enough ASICs available now? Is the network big enough to support all of them? I'm not sure it is. So Bitcoin itself needs to grow. Bitcoin needs to be a bigger network, and the market cap needs to be higher. So that's something. But that's fine, because we know this is a transitional period and it will take time. But how will that lead to more or an increase in the development of renewables? Why does Bitcoin incentivize that? All Bitcoin does is incentivize the buying of energy. But they could buy that off a coal plant. They could buy that off a nuclear plant. They could buy the excess energy from anyone. And they will. So what is this connection here to renewables?
Because if you take the whole subsidy game out of play.
Okay, free market. Full free market.
Then if you look at the marginal cost of a kilowatt hour produced by fossil fuel, it's going to be way higher.
The marginal cost.
Yes.
Because it's zero. The renewable. It's close to zero on wind and solar.
Yeah, and I mean, you need to dig deeper to get the oil actually out of the earth. Yeah. So you need to get it first out. You need to transport it. You need to refine it. You need to transport that again. That all builds cost into the kilowatt hour or the energy that you can get out of it. So there is a natural incentive by simple economics to switch to renewables. Now, yes, it's true. We have the problem of intermittence on the renewable side. But this is not something that we can not solve for. It's just an additional problem which can be solved either through...
Well, it is being solved.
Well, not really. Well, let's be realistic.
No. On 100% grid, no. But the energy sector, like, what was it? Nima we had in yesterday. Nima, we had in yesterday. We were talking about this with him. The energy network originally, like say the UK network, a few decades ago, would have been 10 coal power plants powering an entire country, and now what we have is a highly decentralized, complex network where energy can come from coal, it can come from me with solar panels on my roof. It's a stronger network in some ways because it's become decentralized. Absolutely. But in that, we still have a network which is flexible. We do still have that. So as we've become more decentralized, as we've had more renewables, the network is adapted to become more flexible, to deal with the intermittency. So it is being solved partially. Maybe are you telling me, or you disagree with me, or are you saying it's not solved to the point where we could have a 100% renewable network?
No, it's not solved to a point where we can provide through renewable sources the energy requirement that is needed to substitute fossil fuels. I don't know what the precise percentage is, but
we can produce enough energy from the sources. The intermittency is the issue.
Yes.
So is the...
But this is exactly why you need so much more flexible supply in order to have a grid that is stabilized with the bandwidth.
So you need to overproduce.
Exactly, of course.
And is overproduction enough? Or will you still have an intermittency? I was about to say intimacy issue. Intermittency issue. Can you? Is there or will you still have that? Because
the
it
assumption
sounds to me is like what we need is a balance of nuclear renewables.
Yes.
And some
Case
batteries.
closed.
And by the way, actually,
not only, but I think this is something you mentioned. Germany. I think Germany is a really interesting case because they've coined this term of power to X. Okay, so the idea of temporarily storing power or excess power in other forms is not new. You can do a lot of things. Power to X could be power to mining, could be power to gas, could be power to oil. Yeah, because essentially, if you have higher aggregated molecules, you can synthesize them as much as you can break them down. It's just chemically stored energy. Is it efficient? Not really. But it's a way of how you can actually store energy that doesn't find a demand, which can be dispatched later when you need it. And this is why batteries at scale are so important. But batteries at industrial scale are not there yet.
No, and it feels like one of those hard problems to solve that I don't be seeing solved soon. But that said, Nima said batteries are still being used.
Oh yeah, I mean the whole idea of the German energy transition focusing also on electric vehicles was that you essentially have a mobile fleet of batteries that in aggregate is big enough to provide that balancing factor. It's quite interesting because so what you do there is we are used to very linear energy flows. Okay, there's a generation, there's a transmission, there's a consumption, but these the bidirectional loading capabilities, this is something very new. So essentially you could say, oh, here, dear Tesla driver, here is access of energy, would you mind stopping for 30 minutes to take that off for me? You get a super good price. And at a later point, you could also get the reminder to say, look, I could really use your energy. Do you want to provide that back? And this is the price I pay you.
I actually personally think it's one of the ideas would be to have the batteries also within the home. The idea of the Tesla battery on the wall. I mentioned to Nima, I've looked into having solar panels here.
Yeah.
And the idea was that over time, my energy, I think it pays back over 8 years, and eventually my energy gets cheaper coming from solar. But I said to the guy, well, the scenario I'm actually interested in is a scenario where we have a blackout and I actually still have power. And he's like, okay, well, that's a different solution.
Yes.
You actually need to have a battery. You need to have a battery here, but you also have to have a generator in case there's complete failure. So it's a different scenario. But if there's an overproduction of energy and we are charging the batteries in a home, then the homes could be using those batteries at a time, and the solar could be going straight to the grid.
It's a very interesting conversation to be had because there's so many people who are interested in or we can do this actually live. Yeah. What was your first question that you asked yourself when you were considering the solar panels on your roof?
The how many years would it pay back? Because it's an expensive cost. It was like £30,000.
Yes.
So when
you also ask yourself the question, how much energy is needed? What's sufficient for me to run what I need to run?
No, I don't.
You didn't do that?
No, because I live a life where I turn on the lights and at the end of the month I pay a bill, and the bills. It's only recently I've looked at, because the bills have gone up a lot.
Oh yeah.
But my first question was, what is the payback for the investment? Because £30,000 is a lot of money, right? And if I'm saving, I don't know, a few £1,000s a year on my bills or whatever it was, whatever the cost was, it's like, how many years did it pay back? Maybe it wasn't 8 years, maybe it was longer. But that was my first question. And my second question was, is this a solution if there's a blackout? Will I still have energy in a blackout? Maybe that was the 30,000 to have the additional things of that. Okay. They were the two things I cared about.
But most people care about the dimensioning. They say, well, how much energy do I need? and how much can this thing provide to me?
Oh, so
Yeah.
but for me, that was him solve that.
Mhm.
He's the consultant.
Mm-hmm.
He looks at my energy bill and he tells me what I need on the
Mhm.
roof. My
Mhm.
care about is like how long to repay, and am I protected in a blackout?
Yeah, and what is true for the home is true for the grid.
Yeah.
You know, essentially, this is how we've built energy systems. We say, well, we really know how big demand is at any given time, and these simulations are just very, very robust and very good in most of the cases. And we generate only as much as we need, plus a legally required a buffer, an insurance scheme on top, so that it can fluctuate a bit left and right. But in the future energy systems, I think it's going to look very differently. We say, well, we just provide as much demand as we possibly can, so that we're not limited in the supply we actually generate.
Right.
And that is true for your home, because you can now over-dimension this for your use, for your utility use, so you will then have an oversupply. You can either put that back into the grid, or you can charge your electric car and store it in there and use the energy in case of a blackout. Is that dimensioning enough? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it is. It is.
Yeah.
So
Or you can run a Bitcoin miner and repay a little bit from there.
that as well.
Yes.
A battery with a miner
Mm-hmm.
sounds like a very
Mm-hmm.
good business.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And I think that's a very robust case, because we know, there is also this FUD around old miners will be discarded. Because this is not a very efficient business. It's not going to be like a high intense mining operations,
yeah.
But you just want to use the surplus energy in a way that it makes sense for you. So you will always go for a cheap second-hand S9 that you get basically for free to reduce your capex, have zero opex. So essentially, whatever you mine is yours.
Yeah, I mean, at zero cost energy, every miner,
Yeah.
even an S7,
Mm-hmm.
is beneficial.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so look, what is the pathway? Like, how does this happen?
Mm-hmm.
Because at the moment, we're in a world where 1.5, well, Paris is
Mm-hmm.
done, we're fucked.
Mm-hmm.
1.5 might be missed if we don't get this right. We know if we electrify the grid globally,
Mm-hmm.
we have a chance of hitting that because we're putting less carbon in the atmosphere. We know that if you overproduce and you attach Bitcoin miners, that solves part of the
Mhm.
grid. But how does this all happen? How do we go from a point of view? You and I are just discussing this, and some
Yes.
people do. How do we see meaningful action?
I think this is where it then becomes interesting to educate people, also policymakers. Now, I do not think that if I read, for instance, regulations in Europe that sort of regulate crypto assets, I'm reading it only from the lens, not what does this enable us to do, but what does it potentially, how does it actually potentially jeopardizes the things that I think or you think or we think are necessary so that this can happen at scale. Now, for instance, if I read the MiCA bill, the regulation on crypto asset, which the EU has been putting forward, I was very, very concerned when they tried to attack Bitcoin mining specifically in the first draft of the bill.
Yeah.
So this would have been something hugely concerning for me. Now, I'm super happy to see that this has been voted out.
Yeah.
So it's done.
Yeah.
So the EU...
Laters.
Say again?
We say laters. See you later. See you later, motherfucker.
And I think this is exactly how we need to approach it. Now, the question is, so what? Okay? So at the same time, there are task forces that deal with grid reliances that write huge reports on how important demand response is going to be for the future of the smart grids. But nobody's connecting the dots. So
I mean,
this is hugely problematic for me. I don't care about shitcoin regulations. I don't care about NFTs. I don't care about any of that. It's all regulated. By the way, the good thing is that stablecoins get very, very clearly regulated. So I think this is also a net positive for the community as a whole. But Bitcoin is not mentioned there at all. So it's only attacked through proxy wars,
yeah,
environmental issues, KYC, AML issues, and so on and so forth.
Old school FUD.
Exactly. But I think like the power of the future institutions that we're trying to build is not coming from top down centralized, but we need to build this. And I think this is where we need to sort of make a clean analysis on the problems, make a pragmatic assessment of the situation. I don't care. I mean, 2.2 degrees, 1.5, I don't care. We have a solution that could help us to decarbonize our economies.
Well, Danny and me were talking about this the other day. One of the things we're missing here in the UK and in Europe, we are missing a coin center or a Bitcoin policy
But
institute.
this is exactly the point. If you understand, and this is exactly the point. I'm 100% with you on this. The problem is that institutions that run only on faces need counterparties who only run on faces. So the EU, none of these people understand Bitcoin, only the slightest. So that's why, it's like telling them, have a negotiation with air.
Well, this is why this is why I wanted to talk, and I want to have an open discussion. I say this lightly, like it's just reality, but I want to have a discussion with somebody in the cabinet and say to them, you have green policy agenda, okay? Well, we can help. Bitcoin mining can help this. We can incentivize the growth in renewables, and we have a buyer of last resort who will take that excess energy from you, so we can help you hit your green goals. By the way, at the same time, you can become an innovation center for Bitcoin development within Europe.
I would go even a step further for me.
Yeah, well, and also we can protect ourselves from the policy decisions of your own government's incompetence in the central bank. And that one might not go down so well. Maybe not mention that one. But there's so many benefits to you having a pro Bitcoin agenda. Anyway. You get my point.
I think my dream scenario is the following. We say, look, because we also need to understand there's a language bridge that we need to build. Bitcoin fixes this, didn't help us because it's abstract, it's patronizing, it's not nice. Nobody wants to be treated that way. There's a language piece that needs to feed into this. And I think the SSP language, the shared socioeconomic pathways thing, really helps us there. Because there's nothing wrong with saying, look, behind closed doors or on open doors, we agree the Paris Agreement is not going to fly. But we need to acknowledge a world where we are in a SSP3 world. Your models, which I would really like to see open, do not find a pathway forward for a 1.5 degree world. Now, what would happen if we, into all of these inputs on the different stages, add what we know about Bitcoin right now? And how would the models look different? I'm talking, for instance, about all the methane work that is going on the various fields. It's so exciting, when we understand that only using the flared gas could provide 4 times the energy the input that is required to power the Bitcoin network. I agree. The problem is that the network is too small to actually be a critical player in this game. But this is hopefully only a transitional stage. Yep. Now, when we incorporate the whole work that is done on methane and landfills and flared gas concretely as a mechanism into these models, if we use the whole energy conversation that we just had very concretely, greening energy is just one of the inputs. If you can make that concrete with very clear parameter, what's the size that we need? What's the volume that we need? What would that cost? How many ASICs would that actually be? If you make these models very concrete and you run the models again, would we come to a 1.5 degree world, yes or no? And I think the data are partially there. I got this idea when when reading the work of Daniel Patton.
Yes.
Daniel Patton, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, once we understand that, I would be interested to hear how he ran the model that he gets to a reduction of 0.1 degrees or 0.15, I think even, which is a lot if you think about 1.1 being already priced in. So we have a margin of 0.4. He can provide with his calculations 0.1 already. That's massive. That's not reflected in any of the model work of the IPCC.
Is he the guy in Australia?
He's in New Zealand, yeah.
Why is he so far away?
Could we now pool all this work together that is done in the energy field, that is done in the properties in the properties field, building stocks, that's the thing, in the landfill and methane burning and flare gas work, can we pull this all together? Can we run the same models but with better data? Can we get to a 1.5 degree world? And that's the ultimate nuclear argument for how Bitcoin mining actually makes sense, because it provides already the elements of where from this work onwards, where do we need to engage, or where does it make sense to engage with policymakers to actually build on their language, with their models, rerunning it, but with Bitcoin mining and Bitcoin in the various dimensions as the X factor in the equation. And that would provide a really, really cool civilization pathway, if you want, because we would essentially work in a zero.
Everybody wins.
Exactly. We start in an SSP3 world. We have Bitcoin as the X factor in the middle. Whether you appreciate it or not, but it's good to be at 1.5 degrees. Let's just accept that as common sense. And economically, we would reinstall what we would call an SSP1 world. Because what is this all about? It's all about low time preference, free markets. We're all in for that. And that's what and cooperative worlds. That's exactly what Bitcoin provides. Bitcoin is the SSP1 world. We are living now in a world which is essentially, it's a need creation economy, while what we actually need is a need coverage economy. Yeah. So we're having so much economic output that Bitcoiners would agree we don't need. We're all against frivolous spending, stupid purchases. You know, your Bitcoin is valuable, so you only want to exchange it for the best goods possible. So Bitcoiners, whether they agree or not, share a lot with the left that thinks in sufficiency economics, for instance, or degrowth economics. Bitcoin is the path. It caters to both, I would even call it religions at that point, you know? And so there's a very pragmatic way forward, which builds on realities where we are right now, engages with policymakers and legacy institutions where necessary and appropriate, builds a pathway forward where we say this is now the legitimacy of why we really want to use that energy and how we want to use it to actually end up in a better world, because what we want is a Bitcoin standard.
Brilliant. Okay. So anyone listening, what would you encourage them to do? I would focus on those who are interested in supporting this or being part of this. What is the action now?
I think there are two groups. If you are, my plea would be, let's not get hung up on who's right. This is a net negative for all of us.
Agreed.
We want a cooperative world. Humans are inherently cooperative. We do better when we collaborate and when we cooperate. This is the first one. It makes life gets easier if you start to understand the other side a little better. I've spent my professional life usually always between camps. So before 2017, 2018, when Greta Thunberg essentially started this climate movement, which changed everything, by the way, apolitical, but which changed everything in terms of how the world related to the climate issue, I had to explain what I'm doing. So I was a misfit in the rest of the world. Then I became a Bitcoiner. So anyways, we're weirdos. And now you become a Bitcoiner in the climate space. This is like as weird as it gets.
Mm-hmm.
But
you fucking freak.
I'm used to that. I hear that.
I hear
that often.
Honestly.
So
Keep
for
going.
those who are interested, reach out to me. I would love to bundle that energy. I think Bitcoin, and I know many will. I'm conscious that many will disagree. Bitcoin needs a voice, also in Europe, and it doesn't. And that's inherently the case. Bitcoin doesn't have and it's what makes it fucking brilliant. You know, it doesn't have a leader, it doesn't have a face, and that makes it very strong. But like the Bitcoin Policy Institute in the US, there are moments when it's good to provide an opinion and a voice and a position to a conversation.
Yeah.
And I'm not in the camp of saying, well, Bitcoin doesn't care. Yes, Bitcoin doesn't care, but we can still catalyze a couple of things if we just bring this together. I mean, just take the whole methane conversation. This is so fucking brilliant how many brains now started to work on this. Engineers, philosophers, VCs, modelers. I mean, this is such brilliant brains. And it would be a shame if all of them would act in isolation and not sort of bundle this like the Death Star in a positive way and bring this to a positive explosion.
This is so on my mind, Danny's mind. We're talking about this a lot. We need the equivalent of a Bitcoin Policy Institute in Europe, let's say. People are focused on education and lobbying and having those conversations with policymakers to not inhibit what we're trying to do, but also be more proactive. And I know some people are like, don't work with regulators. Sometimes I think you have to, like the enemy of my enemy or whatever. I think we do, to the point where I'm even thinking of having that conversation with the Policy Institute and saying, look, we will pay for somebody, but can they work under you in Europe? Like, can they work within your structure, but can they be doing the work in Europe? I think it's desperately needed. Danny's been poking me a lot on this.
I think Neil needs to head it up.
Really?
I think he'd be really good at it.
That's a fucking bold statement.
I think he'd be very, very good at it.
I think you're right. His time's already paid.
Exactly.
And if he had to spend more time on that, we would cope without him on this. And that's interesting. I'm going to think about that, but I think that's fucking brilliant. Well done. Okay. I think we need that. Okay, thank you. Really appreciate having you on, Harry. How do people find you, find your work, get in contact?
Well, I'm more the reader on Twitter, but I'll try to get some of these ideas out more regularly. I think it's important. I learned from them, and I think it's I learned from people sharing with me. So I think it's also time to give back. So I'm trying to do better. You find me at Harald Rauter is my full name.
You might have to spell that one.
Yes, HARALDRAUTER.
I think you might increase your follow count a little bit.
Yeah,
guess the numbers.
But you can also write me. You can also write me an email. That's probably the easiest at that point, and that is harold@bitcoinfirst.org.
Okay, so we will put that all in the show notes. We should do a follow-up to this next time we do a European sprint. I definitely want to cover the fourth turning from a thermodynamic cybernetic perspective. We should, who we should try and bring in from that?
Mark.
No.
Brandon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Try and bring Brandon and get
awesome.
the two of you around the table. Go and watch a football match. I'm going to take you to dinner tonight, and then we're going to go watch football tomorrow. Appreciate you, man. This was brilliant. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Anything we can do to help, stay in touch.
Thank you very much.